Like Kurosawa, I make mad films. Okay, I don't make films, but if I did, they'd have a samurai.
Hey class, so for those of you playing along at home, that song that I just played an excerpt from is called One Week by the Bare Naked Ladies, and it is fitting because when you think of Akira Kurosawa, you probably do think of samurais because so many of his films have samurais in them. What's interesting is that Kurosawa himself apparently can trace his lineage back to the samurais in the 11th century Japan. So this video is going to be about Kurosawa's life and his legacy, both as a director of his own films and the legacy that he had on so many different filmmakers and some very important genres of films. And in fact, what becomes really interesting, I think, is that several of the films that he inspired became classics in their own right. Okay, so what do we know about Akira Kurosawa? Well, he was born in Tokyo in 1910, and as I mentioned, his family was a very prominent Japanese family, and they could trace their lineage back to the 11th century, and Kurosawa was told that his family was descended from samurai warriors, and that may help explain why he had such an attachment to the samurais. And while he was certainly steeped in Japanese culture, though, his father thought it very important for him to also be exposed to Western culture, so movie-going was quite a normal activity in his family. And he wanted to, after high school, he wanted to be an artist. And he actually did attend an art school directly out of high school. But then when he was applying to get a position at a film institute, a very prominent director at the time, and I'm going to probably butcher this name, and I apologize if any of you are Japanese speakers, Kajiro Yamamoto, was impressed by his entrance essay and recruited him to become an assistant director. And he did that, and they made about 20 films over a period of about 10 or 15 years. Now, Kurosawa had some medical issues that kept him out of World War II, and so he continued to make films in Japan during this time. And he was able to make his first directorial debut in 1943 with a film called Shanshiro Sugata, and it was a martial arts film. 1948 was probably the first movie that made people start to realize that this guy had some talent and ability, and that was a film called Drunken Angel. That, I don't know if I'd call it exactly a film noir, but it certainly had elements of that. It was a gangster film with the Yakuza, the Japanese mafia, figuring prominently into that movie, and it was Kurosawa's first collaboration. There would be many with Toshiro Mifune, who was a well-known Japanese actor at the time. Now, Kurosawa had a certain following in Japan, but remember, he'd also been exposed to Western culture, and there was going to be this push and pull all throughout his life in terms of what types of projects he did and in terms of the reception he got both at home and abroad. And in 1950, he brings out Rashomon, which I've spoken about, and it was automatically realized as a work of genius, and it was a film that won the Oscar, the Academy Award for Best Foreign Film, and it also was just a big hit internationally. It wasn't as big of a hit back at home, however. And although the adaptation didn't come out until 1964, it was this film, Rashomon, that was the first of his films to eventually be turned into a Western, and that Western was called Outrage, and that film came out in 1964. Now, in terms of his own work, in 1952 he made a film that was vastly different from Rashomon. It was not a samurai film. It was called Ikuru, or also To Live, and it was more of a character study about a man who was dying and wanted to do something to have some sort of lasting legacy, and it was very, very well received. Then 2 years later, in 1954, he brings out what may be his most famous film, and that is The Seven Samurai. And once again, this would be turned into a Western known as The Magnificent Seven, and that adaptation came out in 1960. And what's interesting is I believe it in 2016 that was remade once again. So here we have sort of a third generation film inspired by Akira Kurosawa and the legacy of the samurais. Okay, In 1957, 3 years after Seven Samurai was released, we have the first of his adaptations of Shakespeare's plays, and it is Throne of Blood, which is a retelling of Macbeth. And it is pretty bloody, although Macbeth as a play is, and it is a really interesting film. Now, the next year, he seemed to be really sort of hitting his creative peak. He made a film called Hidden Fortress, and Hidden Fortress isn't so much known for just the film itself, although it certainly was a good film, but it's known because George Lucas cites this as one of his primary influences in the creation of Star Wars. So, and that's going to factor in here, so keep that in the back of your mind. George Lucas, Akira Kurosawa. We will return to that. He feels like he's ready to kind of go out on his own, and so in 1960 he starts his own production company, and the first film that he produces is The Bad Sleep Well, which is a loosely based retelling of Hamlet. Critics, and when you read the article about Kurosawa versus Shakespeare, you'll see that this one is, there's not entirely consensus that this is in fact an adaptation of Hamlet, but it has some elements that are related to the story of Hamlet. Okay, then the next year, in 1961, he releases Yojimbo, which is another samurai film about this kind of wandering samurai going from town to town. That, in 1964, was turned into a Western by Sergio Leone, giving us what we call the spaghetti Western, and that was A Fistful of Dollars, which starred a relatively unknown actor at that time, Clint Eastwood. So we can see that in 1964 we have both A Fistful of Dollars coming out, and we have Outrage coming out as well. So two of his films, and the third that had been made into a Hollywood Western. All right, so and after that success, though, Kurosawa has a period that's pretty difficult for him. He's not being able to find work. Television is changing how people are experiencing their media, and so the Japanese film industry is really not thriving at this time. So Kurosawa decides, all right, well then fine, I'll go to Hollywood. Tries to go to Hollywood and has middling success. He's actually fired from one project. Another project doesn't make it off the ground, and he becomes distraught and actually tries to commit suicide in 1971. Thankfully for us, he's not successful, but he really feels very depressed and despairs of the possibility he's going to be able to direct any more films. Well, out of nowhere, in 1975, he's contacted by a Russian production company to do a movie that is going to be filmed on location in Siberia about a hermit, and that film is called Durzu Uzala, and it turns out to be sort of the rebirth of Kurosawa. It's very well received in 1975 when it's released, and because of that, and because of a couple of years later, we've had this enormous success of Star Wars. George Lucas is able to convince 20th Century Fox and also his contemporary filmmaker Francis Ford Coppola to finance a medieval samurai epic called Kagemusha that is premiered in 1980, and it is a wild success. And again, receives an Oscar nomination for Best Foreign Film, and it wins an award at the Cannes Film Festival. So Kurosawa seemed to be back, and buoyed by that success, he then produces in 1985 the film we're going to be watching, which is Ron, which is the final of his Shakespearean adaptations, this one based on King Lear. And Ron was, I can remember when the movie came out, and I didn't know a whole lot about Kurosawa at the time, and some of my friends said, oh, you've got to see this movie, and I went to see it, and I was just blown away. It was truly mesmerizing, and it's a beautiful film, and I think you're going to see that earlier training of Kurosawa as a painter in this film. Okay, so a few years later, he produces a film called Dreams, which is kind of an experimental film of sorts, and this time he has help from another well-known Hollywood younger film director, Steven Spielberg. And so students, you can see, this is the sort of influence that Kurosawa had on not only Japanese cinema, but on world cinema. He gives us the film that becomes the basis for The Magnificent Seven. He gives us the film that becomes the basis for A Fistful of Dollars and the spaghetti western. He gives us a film that is hugely influential for George Lucas in his creation of Star Wars. He's got friends like Francis Ford Coppola, who directed the Godfather trilogy, and Steven Spielberg, who is arguably one of our best known and most accomplished directors currently working in cinema today. So Dreams unfortunately doesn't do terribly well at the box office. But in that same year at the Academy Awards, George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, they award Akira Kurosawa an honorary Oscar for his achievement, his lifetime achievement in film. He then continues to try to make films in the early 90s and makes a couple of films, but his health begins to fail and he has an accident where he breaks his back and he is confined to a wheelchair, and he finally dies at the age of 88 in Tokyo in 1998. And I think what is perhaps so good about this story is that by the time of his death, he was once again revered as a filmmaker in his native Japan and also throughout the world, and his influence continues even to this day.